Most people believe that civilization is the natural antidote to violence, that social, political, and technological advancement makes us less barbaric, more rational, more human. The dominant narrative teaches us that violence belongs to the past, to tribal wars, decaying empires, the dark periods of history. Today, in democratic, modern, and supposedly enlightened societies, we prefer to imagine that we have overcome these primitive impulses. But this belief, as comforting as it may seem, can be one of the most dangerous illusions of our time. The thesis that this video explores is unsettling. Violence has not disappeared with civilization. It has been refined. And more than that, it has been incorporated as a functional tool within power structures. Modern society does not eliminate violence. It manages, channels, and camouflages it behind institutions, discourses, and bureaucracies. Direct repression has given way to legal punishment, symbolic exclusion, and forced silence. But the logic remains the same. Identify an enemy, project our frustrations onto them, and keep them marginalized to ensure the stability of the whole. This perspective is not new. René Girard, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, asserted that violence is the ritual heart of human culture. In his work, Violence and the Sacred, he argues that social cohesion has historically been built from mechanisms of imitation, rivalry, and sacrifice. Society needs victims to remain united, and these victims are chosen through a process that seems natural but is deeply conditioned. The elite, throughout history, has understood this game better than anyone. It is not that they try to eradicate violence, they just make sure it is never directed against themselves. But violence does not operate only in external structures. Carl Jung, diving into the depths of the human psyche, revealed that what we reject in ourselves, anger, fear, the destructive instinct, does not disappear. He called this hidden side of the personality the shadow. When society, in the name of civilization, demands that we completely repress our aggressive impulses, this energy is projected outward. Minorities, political enemies, lower social classes, all become repositories of what we do not want to see in ourselves. This video proposes a deep dive into this uncomfortable reality. The violence that surrounds us, on social media, in public policies, in news reports, in polarized discourses, is not a failure of the system. It is an essential part of its functioning. The modern individual, convinced of their own morality, often acts as an unconscious accomplice to violent systems, believing they are defending peace. The repression of violence, both individual and collective, generates only more sophisticated forms of aggression, and more difficult to identify. Is it possible to have a truly peaceful society? Or are we just trading swords for algorithms, bonfires for digital lynchings, colosseums for media tribunals? What happens when violence becomes invisible and turns institutional, symbolic, psychological? And, more importantly, how can we integrate our own shadow so that we do not become blind instruments of this machinery? These are the questions that this video will explore, not as gratuitous provocation, but as an invitation to lucidity. Because understanding the psychology of violence is perhaps the first step to escaping its cycle. Human violence is often interpreted as a moral failure or as an irrational explosion of primitive instincts. However, for René Girard, this view is profoundly mistaken. In his theory of mimetic desire, he proposes that the root of violence does not lie in biological instinct, as in animals, but in something typically human, imitation. We do not desire things simply for ourselves. We desire what we see others desiring. Desire, according to Girard, is mimetic, and it is precisely this mimetism that creates rivalry, frustration, and, inevitably, conflict. Imagine two individuals observing an initially neutral object. If one of them shows desire for that object, the other begins to imitate him. not because he truly desires the object itself, but because he desires the other's desire. The object becomes a symbol of prestige, status, or identity. And then, conflict is born. Mimetic rivalry transforms the other into an obstacle. The desire, which seemed harmless, becomes a motor of hostility. But what does this have to do with entire societies? Everything. When social groups or nations enter into disputes, the logic is no different. What begins as a symbolic difference transforms, through imitation and competition, into enmity. And to prevent this spiral of violence from destroying the community, an ancestral mechanism comes into play: the scapegoat. Girard's central thesis is that all human culture stabilizes through a founding act of violence: the choice of a common victim. In times of crisis, society unconsciously chooses an individual or a group, someone perceived as different, strange, marginal, and blames them for all the ills affecting the collective. This victim is sacrificed or excluded, and with that, peace is temporarily restored. Not because the real cause of the conflict has been resolved, but because chaos has been channeled toward a symbolic target. Girard demonstrates that founding myths, ancient religions, sacrificial rituals, and even modern legal structures carry traces of this process. Mimetic violence is, therefore, the secret gear of culture. And the most disturbing part, it works. The community finds cohesion through exclusion. Order is maintained through the sacrifice of innocence. Peace is bought with blood. In modernity, the scapegoat mechanism has not disappeared. It has merely become more sophisticated. Victims are no longer burned in public squares, but are destroyed on social media, marginalized by public policies, demonized by the media, incarcerated by selective legal systems. The elite perfectly understands this dynamic. They do not oppose violence. They direct it, shape it, manipulate it. Power sustains itself by keeping collective desire in constant conflict, as long as that conflict never turns against those who control the gears. Violence, then, ceases to be a flaw in the system. It becomes part of its design. It is channeled against ideological enemies, ethnic minorities, marginalized social classes, any group that serves as a release for collective emotional discharge. The function is not to resolve the crisis, but to offer a simulacrum of a solution that keeps the social hierarchy intact. If violence is mimetic and structuring, how does it remain invisible to most people? Why do so many genuinely believe they live in peaceful societies while participating, even unconsciously, in these mechanisms of exclusion? This is where Carl Jung's contribution comes in, offering a psychological explanation for this process of collective blindness. In the next segment, we will delve into the theory of the collective shadow and understand how the human psyche dissociates from its own aggressiveness, projecting it outward, and with that, becomes an easy prey for violent systems. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. We believe that we live in societies based on justice, ethics, and reason. That institutions were created to protect citizens and ensure social peace. But this is a carefully constructed narrative and often illusory. When we observe the actual functioning of power structures, we perceive something much more unsettling. The elite does not combat violence, it manages it as a strategic resource. Instead of repressing collective aggression, the system has learned to channel it, manipulating its flow in a way that preserves political stability and the continuity of power. Violence is not seen as a problem, but as a tool, as long as it is applied selectively and outside the centers of privilege. Just look at how the legal system operates. Laws are presented as impartial, but in practice, punishment is disproportionately applied to certain social strata, The poor, black people, immigrants, political dissidents. The same behaviors are treated completely differently depending on who practices them. A wealthy young person commits a crime and is seen as someone with a promising future. A poor young person commits the same act and is considered a threat that needs to be contained. This is not an error, it is intentional architecture. This logic extends to the media, which carefully selects which violences will be shown, amplified, or ignored. Popular protests are labeled as vandalism. Police repression is justified as maintaining order. The suffering of certain groups is naturalized, while others are protected by an invisible shield of symbolic and institutional privileges. Public policies follow the same machinery. Instead of investing in education, mental health, or reducing inequalities, which would be effective ways to prevent violence, governments prefer to increase the police budget, toughen penalties, and build more prisons. The discourse is always the same: security. But the result is predictable: more violence, more incarceration, more control. The elite does not want to end violence. It wants to ensure that violence never turns against it. This strategic management also works through fear. Moral panic is a powerful tool for controlling the masses. When the population lives under constant threat, whether from crime, terrorism, economic collapse, or social disorder, it becomes more susceptible to accepting authoritarian measures, extreme surveillance, and suppression of rights. And who benefits from this? Always the same: those who profit from maintaining the status quo. There is, therefore, a psychological engineering at play, a collective conditioning that shapes our perception of reality. The ordinary citizen, convinced that they are protected, does not realize that they are also a piece on the board, often an unconscious accomplice to deeply violent structures. Violence becomes invisible because it has been outsourced, aestheticized, and justified. And the more the individual believes they live in a civilized society, the less they suspect their role in perpetuating that violence. But what happens to the subject who internalizes this civilizational discourse? What occurs to the natural aggression that is repressed in the name of order and morality? Does it disappear? Or does it transform into something even more dangerous? The answer lies in the depths of the human psyche. In the next segment, we will explore how Carl Jung reveals the psychological impact of this collective repression, and how it gives rise to a disturbing phenomenon: the massive projection of the collective shadow onto marginalized groups, fueling even more destructive unconscious violences. While Girard reveals the structural logic of violence, how it is socially organized through scapegoats and mimetic desires, Carl Gustav Jung offers us a key to understanding why seemingly civilized individuals continue to unconsciously participate in violent systems. The answer, according to him, lies in what the modern psyche refuses to see: the collective shadow. For Jung, the shadow is the part of the psyche that contains everything the individual or society rejects, represses, or considers unacceptable. Aggressive instincts, selfish desires, destructive impulses. All these contents, when not consciously recognized, are pushed into the unconscious, but they do not disappear. On the contrary, they become more dangerous precisely because they operate outside the realm of consciousness. In modern societies, where the appearance of rationality, kindness, and order is valued, the natural aggressiveness of human beings is systematically repressed. From childhood, we are conditioned to believe that feeling anger is wrong, that desiring power is ugly, that fighting for oneself is selfish. Thus, we internalize a behavioral ideal that suppresses our most primitive forces, and in doing so, we lose contact with our psychic wholeness. What Jung observed is that when these energies are not consciously integrated, they are projected outward. This means we begin to see in others what we do not accept in ourselves: minorities, foreigners, political dissidents, public figures. All can become targets of these projections. We come to hate in them the anger we do not admit to feeling, the strength we are afraid to exercise, or the freedom we repress in the name of order. This psychological process is not just individual. When an entire society denies its aggressive impulses, what forms is a collective dissociation, a kind of moral amnesia that allows good people to support brutal policies, legitimize wars, ignore genocides, and reproduce hate speech, all while believing they are defending peace. The shadow, when projected on a large scale, transforms entire societies into unconscious instruments of systemic violence. Jung argues that this dissociation has devastating consequences. It not only fuels mechanisms of social exclusion, it also weakens the individual's own capacity to perceive their participation in collective evil. Once the shadow is out there, embodied in the other, everything done against that other is justified. Police violence, necessary, detention camps, preventive measure, censorship, protection of order. The collective unconscious creates a narrative where the aggressor sees themselves as a protector and the victim is labeled as a threat. This is fertile ground for the rise of authoritarian regimes, for the advancement of fanaticism, and for the emergence of leaders who embody exactly the aggressiveness that society has rejected and now admires from a distance without taking responsibility. As Jung once said, the greater the ignorance of the shadow, the more the human soul fragments, and the more evil grows on a collective scale. But the repression of aggressiveness not only destroys the collective, it also sickens the individual. Many people who consider themselves peaceful, balanced, and civilized are, in fact, on the brink of emotional collapse. They live suffocating their impulses until one day they explode. And it is precisely here that the next point of this analysis comes in. In the next part, we will explore how this chronic repression of the shadow gives rise to the so-called violence complexes described by Jung, outbursts of disproportionate anger, support for punitive policies, and even unconscious participation in structures of exclusion and cruelty. Because the violence that is denied always finds a way to return. Carl Jung did not see the human psyche as something static, but as a dynamic system of forces seeking balance. When natural impulses, such as aggression, are excessively repressed, they do not disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, generating a growing psychic tension that eventually needs to express itself. It is in this context that Jung describes the formation of so-called violence complexes, autonomous cores within the psyche that carry repressed content and, under certain conditions, take control of behavior. These complexes are like emotional time bombs. A person may spend years cultivating an image of kindness, calmness, civility. But it only takes one trigger, a stressful situation, a frustration, a symbolic threat, for a completely disproportionate reaction to arise, an outburst of rage, a nervous breakdown, an aggressive attitude that seems to come out of nowhere. The individual, overtaken by this outburst, often does not even recognize themselves in the act. And indeed, at that moment, it is not them who is in control. It is the repressed complex that has taken command. However, not all of these complexes manifest explosively or visibly. Jung also observed a much more insidious form of expression of repressed violence, unconscious participation in collective systems of exclusion and punishment. This is when someone, without realizing it, adheres to punitive discourses, legitimizes institutional abuses, shares violent fake news, practices bullying, or remains silent in the face of glaring injustices, all while maintaining, on a conscious level, the self-image of a just and balanced person. This is the typical behavior of the civilized subject who, in the name of order, normalizes cruelty. They do not hit, but applaud those who do. They do not directly discriminate, but support policies that do. They do not participate in violence with their hands, but participate with their omission, their rationalization, or their silence. And they do so believing they are on the right side, because the complex does not present itself as evil, but as just, protective, moral. This split between the ideal self and the shadow self makes the subject extremely vulnerable to ideological manipulations. As they do not recognize their own capacity for violence, any suggestion of external threat, real or imagined, awakens in them a compulsive need for defense. It is the perfect trigger for authoritarian discourses, repressive policies, and symbolic lynchings, all in the name of security, family, morality. But what is really happening is the release, through indirect means, of the violence that has been internally denied. Jung asserted that this dissociation not only makes the individual ill, but undermines their capacity for psychic growth. As long as the shadow is not integrated, the subject remains fragmented, alienated from themselves, and therefore unable to act in a truly conscious and ethical manner. The repression of aggression does not generate peace. It generates neurosis, conformism, and complicity. And the more society values idealized images of goodness, the more intense the repression, and the more violent the symptoms. It is no coincidence that many acts of extreme violence occur in contexts where there is strong moral and social pressure for exemplary behavior. The mask of civilization, when cracked, reveals a psychic abyss that has long been neglected. But if repression leads to fragmentation and blind complicity, what would be the alternative? How to channel this aggressive energy constructively? How to avoid becoming slaves to our complexes and at the same time not become instruments of systemic violence? The answer lies in the conscious integration of violence as a legitimate part of the human psyche. In the next segment, we will explore how the illusion of a non-violent society can, paradoxically, produce even more perverse forms of violence, silent, invisible, bureaucratic, and how true pacification begins when we recognize and transform our shadow instead of projecting it. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. We live under a carefully constructed illusion that civilizational progress has distanced us from barbarism, that modern societies are examples of harmony, justice, and civility. This belief is deeply comforting, but dangerously misguided. Because, as René Girard and Carl Jung revealed, the more a society believes it is peaceful, the more likely its violence has been displaced to the unconscious, symbolic, or institutional level. And it is precisely there that it becomes more effective, more perverse, and more difficult to combat. The most cruel forms of contemporary violence are not committed by armed criminals on the streets, but by perfectly legal structures, operated in silence, with the bureaucratic coldness of systems that punish, exclude, and kill, with signature and stamp. Violence has ceased to be explicit. Now it wears a suit, speaks technically, and acts under the pretext of efficiency, order, and progress. It is the violence of algorithms that decide who will be invisible, of neutral criteria that determine who deserves assistance and who should be discarded, of public policies that marginalize without ever getting their hands dirty. This structural violence, as philosopher Slavoj Žižek would say, is the most dangerous of all precisely because it presents itself as neutral, rational, apolitical. It operates under the guise of normality. And the ordinary citizen, by adhering to the norms, discourses, and dominant values, ends up becoming an active part of a system that perpetuates inequalities, that produces suffering, and that constantly needs new scapegoats to maintain its internal cohesion. The big problem lies in the symbolic displacement of violence. The modern individual has learned not to perceive themselves as violent. After all, they pay their taxes, recycle waste, follow the rules, and consider themselves a good person. But what Jung shows us is that this perception is dangerously superficial. The shadow does not cease to exist because we adopt good social practices. It merely gets repressed. And when aggressive energy is not consciously recognized, it seeks other avenues of expression. The unconscious pleasure in seeing the other punished, the veiled hatred disguised as opinion, the moral judgment that replaces empathy. This creates a very specific type of contemporary subject, the unconscious accomplice. They do not see themselves as part of the problem because they believe they are on the side of order, civility, and justice. But their silence in the face of injustice, their adherence to exclusionary discourses, their irrational fear of the other, all of this transforms them into a vector of systemic violence. It is no longer about committing violent acts, but about legitimizing them through one's own passivity. And that is what makes modern society so dangerously hypocritical, because it prides itself on no longer burning witches while destroying reputations with mass cancellations, because it claims to have overcome slavery while allowing entire populations to be exploited under inhumane conditions, because it preaches equality but fiercely protects privileges, using the language of law, economics, or religion to justify the unjustifiable. That is why Girard asserts, violence is the most effective mechanism of social control, precisely because it works best when it is not perceived as such. When it is integrated into language, institutions, and cultural norms. The elite understands this game better than anyone. They no longer need to suppress revolts with weapons. They just need to manipulate symbols, control narratives, and construct convenient enemies. And the crowd, hungry for moral direction, does the rest of the work. But there is a way out. Jung proposes that true pacification begins when we stop projecting our shadow onto others and start integrating it consciously, when we recognize that the capacity to hate, to hurt, to exclude is also ours. Denying this reality turns us into pawns. Recognizing it can make us conscious, free, and dangerous to a system that depends on our unconsciousness. In the next and final segment, we will explore Jung's proposal in depth, the path of shadow integration, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a real process of psychic and social transformation. Because only when we face our own violence head-on do we cease to be instruments of it. Carl Jung did not believe that violence could be extinguished from the human psyche, let alone that it was desirable. For him, aggressiveness is a vital, primordial energy that is part of the totality of being. Repressing this force does not make us more evolved. It only makes us more unconscious, more fragmented, and more susceptible to manipulation. True psychological maturity, according to Jung, lies not in denying our dark impulses, but in recognizing, accepting, and channeling them in a conscious and constructive way. This is the proposal of shadow integration, a deep, uncomfortable, and absolutely transformative process. It requires courage to look within and admit that what we hate in others is often a mirror of what we deny in ourselves. It requires humility to recognize that we are indeed capable of hating, desiring power, and taking pleasure in domination. And it requires responsibility not to act on these impulses blindly or destructively, but to use them as fuel for internal and collective transformation. Jung saw the human being as a potential totality, a living mandala in which light and shadow coexist. Integrating the shadow does not mean yielding to violence, but acknowledging its existence within us so that it does not need to manifest in a distorted, projected, pathological way. When someone recognizes their anger, for example, they can channel it towards justice, creation, or resistance. But when they pretend not to feel anger, that energy transforms into resentment, passive aggression, or rationalized cruelty. This process is not just individual. Entire societies need to traverse the same path. Countries that refuse to confront their violent past tend to repeat their mistakes in new forms. Institutions that refuse to admit their mechanisms of exclusion perpetuate discrimination disguised as norms. And populations that live believing they are peaceful, civilized, and moral often contribute the most to the maintenance of structural violence. Therefore, the question that should continue to echo after this video is not how to eliminate violence, but rather how to stop being its unconscious instrument. The answer is clear: through awareness, through the radical willingness to see oneself as one truly is, by abandoning the illusion of moral purity, by accepting that no transformation is possible without confronting what we fear most within ourselves. Integrating the shadow is the most revolutionary act a human being can perform. Because a person who embraces their totality, who no longer needs to project, judge, or punish others to feel just, is a person that the system can no longer control. That is why this journey is so feared and so necessary. Now I want to hear from you. Which part of this analysis provoked you the most? What made you reflect more deeply on the violence that resides within us and that we often pretend is not there? Leave your comment below. Let's transform this video into a real space for reflection and exchange. And if this message resonated with you, don't stop here. The next video in the sequence is equally important, perhaps even more than this one. It continues this journey of self-knowledge and deep revelations about the human mind and the world we live in. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This type of content is not made to go viral, but to transform. And transformation, as you already know, requires awareness. See you in the next video.